They thought they were heading to the edge of the world, but they were really heading beyond it. In September 1944, while the Reich crumbled under Allied bombing and German troops retreated on every front, a small group of soldiers and meteorologists boarded a U-boat in the port of Tromsø, Norway. Their orders were simple, yet absurd. Establish and operate an Arctic weather station at all costs. The mission was Operation Haudegen, a last desperate attempt by the German High Command to maintain control of the North Atlantic skies. The Luftwaffe's bombers and the U-boats that prowled beneath the waves depended on weather forecasts to plan raids, avoid storms, and strike at Allied convoys. But by 1944, Germany's network of weather stations had been destroyed or captured. Without them, every submarine and aircraft operated blind. So Berlin turned to the Arctic, to the frozen islands of Svalbard, more than 500 miles north of the mainland, where the sun disappeared for months and temperatures plunged to 50 degrees Celsius. There, at the top of the world, a handful of men would keep the war alive with radio transmissions of wind speed and barometric pressure. They were led by Dr. Wilhelm Dege, a geographer and meteorologist from Bremen. Unlike most SS officers, Dege wasn't a soldier by heart. He was a scientist, intelligent, meticulous, and patriotic enough to obey orders, even when those orders made no sense. His men were a mix of meteorologists, radio operators, and infantry, a skeleton crew of soldiers and scientists bound for a place where no one sane would go. Their submarine, U-307, cut through Arctic waters under a low, pale sun. Ice formed on the deck, snow crusted over the periscope, and the men huddled inside, sweating in the diesel fumes, silent except for the rattle of the engine. When they surfaced near Nordostland, one of the most desolate parts of Svalbard, the wind howled like a living thing. The U-boat commander wanted to turn back. The currents were unpredictable, the ice closing fast, but Dege insisted. The station had to be established, no matter the cost. Berlin was counting on them. For 3 days, they unloaded crates of equipment onto the shore. Radios, generators, fuel drums, rifles, and food. They built wooden huts on the frozen tundra, anchored by sandbags that froze solid overnight. When the submarine left, slipping back beneath the waves, its rumble faded into the endless wind. And the men of Haudegen realized the truth. They were utterly alone. No reinforcements, no supply lines, no escape route until the following summer. Ahead of them lay the Arctic winter, 4 months of total darkness. Their orders were clear. Transmit weather data to the High Command twice daily. Remain operational regardless of local conditions. Regardless of local conditions. That phrase would haunt them, because soon the local conditions would become their enemy. The wind would tear their antennas down. The cold would seize their lungs and the silence would begin to whisper. They had come to fight for Hitler's Reich, but they would soon be fighting for their sanity and their survival at the edge of the world. The Arctic did not greet them like a new posting. It swallowed them whole. The men of Operation Haudegen soon learned that their real enemy wasn't the Allies, but the North itself. By October 1944, the sun had vanished beneath the horizon for the last time that year. A blue twilight lingered for an hour each day before vanishing into complete darkness. The sea froze into a shifting, cracking plain of ice. The air burned their lungs with every breath. They were the northernmost soldiers of the Third Reich, and they were already fighting for their lives. Their camp consisted of a few wooden huts on the shore of Nordostland, a barren wasteland of ice and rock. They named it Haudegen Wetterstation, Station Haudegen, after the code name of their mission. Inside, the temperature rarely rose above freezing, even with the stoves burning night and day. The walls were thin, the windows frosted over from the inside. The men hung blankets and tarps to trap what little warmth there was, but still their breath turned to crystals in the air. Outside, the wind howled at 80 kilometers an hour, carrying snow that never seemed to fall. It attacked cutting across the skin like knives. The ice cracked and boomed like artillery in the distance. Polar bears prowled the shoreline, drawn by the scent of food and diesel. The men carried rifles even to the latrine. They worked in 12-hour shifts, taking meteorological readings and transmitting them to Berlin twice daily. Air pressure, wind direction, humidity. The data that once guided Luftwaffe squadrons and U-boats now served a collapsing empire that barely listened. Yet orders were orders, and they followed them to the letter. When the generator froze, they thawed it with open flames. When the radio antenna snapped in the wind, they climbed the tower in the dark to repair it, frost coating their eyelashes. They wrapped rags around their faces until only their eyes showed. Not for camouflage, but for survival. One soldier wrote in his diary, "It is not war here, it is eternity. We are no longer fighting men. We are ghosts who measure the air." Their daily ration was mostly canned meat and dried bread. Fresh water came from melting ice blocks in a steel drum over a kerosene stove, the fuel so precious they counted every drop. The silence between radio transmissions was suffocating. Some men began to hear voices in the wind. Others started talking to the walls. When the weather cleared, which was rare, they ventured out on short patrols to collect supplies dropped by parachute. Once a crate shattered on impact, scattering equipment across the snow. The men chased it down, their fingers black with frostbite, laughing hysterically at the absurdity of running through a blizzard to save barometers. And still every night the radio operator signed on, "Haudigan calling, weather report follows." They didn't know that the world they were serving was already collapsing. The Reich cities were burning, its armies retreating, its U-boats hunted across the Atlantic. But up here, 1,000 miles from the nearest human being, none of that mattered. The Arctic had no politics, no nations, only cold. And in that cold, the men of Haudigan began to realize that they were not just outposts of Hitler's war, they were prisoners of it. By December 1944, the Arctic night had become absolute. The sun no longer rose at all, not even as a glow on the horizon. The men of Operation Haudigan lived in a world of endless darkness, their only light the hiss of kerosene lamps and the faint green shimmer of the northern lights flickering above their camp. The snow swallowed sound. Even the sea, once a restless growl beneath the ice, fell silent. The isolation was total, and it began to eat away at their minds. Inside their thin wooden huts, frost crawled across the walls like spider webs. The stoves burned constantly, fed with coal and scraps of wood, yet the air never truly warmed. When they woke, their blankets were stiff with ice from their own breath. Boots froze solid overnight. The simple act of dressing became torture, forcing numb feet into frozen leather, waiting for the pain to return as circulation crept back. Every man found his own ritual to stay sane. Dr. Wilhelm Dager, the expedition leader, kept a meticulous log, not only of weather data, but of every event, every malfunction, every injury. He wrote as if someone someday would want to understand. "Science," he told his men, "is our purpose. Without it, we are lost." Radio operator Walter Dries kept the transmission schedule alive. Twice a day, no matter the storm, he tuned the transmitter to 39.40 kilohertz and sent coded weather reports to Germany. He didn't know if anyone still received them. The lines often crackled with static. Sometimes silence, sometimes ghostly voices from distant ships. But he kept transmitting. Others fought boredom with absurdity. One man carved chess pieces out of whalebone. Another painted a mural of palm trees and women on the inside of a storage hut pretending they were in the tropics. They celebrated Christmas with canned ham and melted snow water punch singing quietly beneath frost-coated rafters. But the Arctic was relentless. Frostbite spread across fingers and cheeks. Diesel thickened into jelly. Batteries died without warning. The wind tore their radio antenna down 3 times in 1 week, forcing them to climb the frozen mast in pitch darkness while shards of ice whipped their faces. Polar bears were constant visitors. The soldiers gave them names. Hans, Otto, the Major. until one night a bear broke into a supply hut and mauled a man before they drove it away with flares and rifle fire. After that, they built a perimeter of wire and hung bells on it. The wind made them ring day and night, a cold, mocking music. Deej's diary from that winter reads like a descent into another planet. The darkness presses upon the soul. The ice creaks in the night like cannon fire. The men speak little. When they dream of warmth. By February 1945, the monotony was worse than fear. There was no sense of time, no sunrise to mark the days. They worked, ate, slept, repaired, over and over until even the routine began to fray. Then one night, the radio brought a faint human voice through the static. A message from Berlin. Hold position. Continue transmissions. The fatherland will prevail. They stared at the speaker in silence. Outside, the wind screamed across an island of ice, and the thermometer read -48. The fatherland, Deej whispered, is very far away. And in that moment, every man understood. They were keeping alive not a war, but a ghost. By March 1945, the men of Operation Haudegan had stopped believing in seasons. The Arctic no longer changed. It devoured time. Their clocks still ticked, their radio still hummed, but the world around them had become a single, endless night, broken only by the moan of wind and the sharp crack of shifting ice. They worked mechanically now, driven not by duty or ideology, but by habit, the discipline of men who knew that routine was the only thing keeping them sane. Every 12 hours, they trudged through snowdrifts waist deep to take their readings. Wind speed, barometric pressure, humidity, temperature. Each figure mattered less and less, yet they recorded them with military precision. It was the last link to a world that had forgotten them. Their leader, Dr. Wilhelm Dege, remained the anchor. He forced the men to shave, to keep logs, to maintain order. If we surrender to the cold, he told them, it wins. He believed in science, in the discipline of observation, but even he began to see what the Arctic did to the mind. At times, the sky flickered green with the aurora, shifting in waves like ghosts across the horizon. Some of the men claimed to see shapes in the light, faces, figures, eyes watching them from above. Others laughed it off until one night a storm hit without warning. The wind roared like an explosion, ripping the antenna from its mount and scattering crates across the tundra. For 2 days the men stayed inside, listening to the storm hammer the walls. They had no contact with Berlin. The radio mast was down, the wires encased in ice. When the storm finally broke, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Radio operator Walter Dries spent hours trying to re-establish contact. Static, hiss, then faintly a transmission, barely intelligible through the noise. Enemy, approaching, hold position, continue reporting. No one could tell if it was real or a ghost signal echoing from somewhere thousands of miles away. Enemy, one soldier repeated. What enemy? The only thing here that kills us is the weather. Supplies were running low. Their canned rations had frozen into solid bricks. Kerosene was dwindling. Men burned spare wood, furniture, anything that would catch flame. Their rifles rusted. Their boots split. They began rationing coffee to a single cup a day. Deje wrote in his diary, "The weather we record now is no longer for the Reich. It is for survival. The ice does not care who wins this war." Outside, the bears returned, hungrier now. One was found dead near camp, ribs jutting through white fur, starved, just like them. The Arctic killed everything equally. Then came a strange phenomenon, a faint orange glow on the southern horizon. At first, they thought it was sunrise. Then they remembered. The sun would not return for weeks. The glow was something else. Perhaps the reflection of distant auroras, or maybe the mind playing tricks. Maybe. "Berlin is burning," one man whispered. No one answered. The next morning, they raised a new antenna. The first transmission they received was fragmentary but clear enough. "Heavy fighting in Berlin. Russians. Evacuation imminent. The men stood frozen, staring at the receiver. The war, the entire war they had been serving, was collapsing, but here, on their island, the wind kept blowing, the ice kept cracking, and the same old data still needed to be sent. They returned to their instruments, recorded another set of numbers, and transmitted them into the void. It was all they had left, a ritual for a country that no longer existed. In May 1945, the radio brought the message that changed the world, but reached the Arctic like a whisper from another planet. The Führer is dead. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The words came through the static one evening, faint but unmistakable. The men of Operation Haudigan stared at the receiver in silence. For months they had lived in darkness, frost, and isolation. Yet they had kept working, kept transmitting, believing that somewhere, someone in Berlin was listening. Now, that world was gone. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one of the soldiers said quietly, "So, we are free." Dr. Wilhelm Dege looked up from his logbook. "Free?" he said softly. "We are more trapped than ever." And he was right. Their radio contact ceased almost completely after that night. No new orders, no evacuation instructions, no rescue. The U-boats that might have come for them were sunk or surrendered. The Reich that had sent them north no longer existed. On that frozen island, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, they had become the last soldiers of a dead empire. At first, the men waited. 1 week, then 2. They repaired the antenna, kept sending weather reports, kept hoping for a reply. Nothing. The silence from the south grew heavier than the cold. The Arctic summer began, if you could call it that. The sun returned, circling the sky without setting, turning the snow to blinding mirrors of light. Meltwater dripped from the roofs. The air smelled faintly of salt and decay. But the thaw brought no ships, no planes, no rescue. They tried to act as if their mission still mattered. Dage insisted on maintaining the routine. Weather readings, log entries, equipment checks. "We will not lose ourselves," he said. But the others had stopped believing. The Reich was ash, Berlin a ruin. Every report they sent now went nowhere. Some men began to unravel. One refused to leave his bunk for days, mumbling about hearing voices on the wind. Another grew obsessed with counting ice flows through binoculars, convinced they were ships. They argued about whether they should try to reach the mainland, a suicidal idea. The nearest coast was hundreds of miles of shifting ice and open sea away. Once a distant engine sound made them rush outside. They stood on the shore, waving flares, shouting into the wind. It was only the groan of moving pack ice. The echo lingered long after they fell silent. Supplies dwindled. They slaughtered what was left of their sled dogs and melted the fat for lamps. They boiled seaweed and chewed frozen bread. The Arctic, which had once felt vast and indifferent, now pressed down like a weight. The horizon itself seemed to close around them. In his diary, Dage wrote, "The war is over, but not here. Here, it continues in the heart, against hunger, against madness, against the ice." Weeks passed. The men began marking time on the wall of their hut with scratches, counting the days since Germany's surrender. When they ran out of space, they started a second line below. They were no longer soldiers. They were survivors of a war that the world had already finished. And as the midnight sun spun endlessly above their camp, one truth became clear. The only enemy left was the Arctic, and it was winning. The war had ended everywhere, except here. By late summer 1945, the men of Operation Haudigan were still stranded on the island of Nordostland, frozen between seasons and forgotten by history. The world had moved on, but the Arctic held them in place, like insects trapped in amber. No one came. No messages arrived. The radio hissed endlessly with static, its only voice the wind. Their antenna stood crooked, covered in salt and rime, still transmitting weather reports into a world that no longer needed them. Each day began the same way. Deje woke first, lit the stove with what little kerosene remained, and checked the instruments. The others rose slowly, their movements mechanical, eyes hollow. They recorded temperatures, winds, pressure, the ritual of science now reduced to survival. Without it, they would lose their minds. They called their calendar the days after surrender. Day 1 had been filled with confusion, day 10 with hunger, day 50 with silence. By day 100, words had lost meaning. Their food was nearly gone. The canned meat was rancid, the bread moldy. They hunted seals with rusty rifles and boiled the meat until the fat turned the broth white. Once they caught a polar bear and celebrated as if they had taken Berlin. The skin became blankets, the bones, tools. Nothing went to waste, but the Arctic took its toll. Frostbite blackened fingers. Joints ached constantly. 2 men developed trench foot from standing in melting snow inside their leaking boots. DJ treated them as best he could, with alcohol, rags, and words. The endless daylight returned in June. The sun spun in circles above the horizon, never setting, mocking them with its indifference. Sleep became impossible. Some men began speaking of things that weren't there. Voices calling from the ice, music drifting over the wind, the sound of a motor that never came. Dej wrote in his diary, "The Arctic is no longer landscape. It is consciousness itself, wide, silent, and pitiless. One begins to see the cold as a living thing." To distract them, he ordered daily expeditions. They mapped the coastline, collected rock samples, took photographs. It was absurd. Germany had surrendered, yet its soldiers were still conducting scientific missions for a government that no longer existed, but the discipline gave them purpose. One evening, while taking barometric readings, they saw smoke on the horizon. They rushed to the shore, lighting flares, waving arms, but the smoke faded into fog. Another hallucination, perhaps, or maybe a ship that decided not to risk the ice. That night, Deej gathered the men in the mess hut. The kerosene lamp flickered weakly. "We can't last another winter here," he said simply. No one disagreed. They began building a signal fire on the cliffs, a towering pile of crates, oil drums, and scraps of wood. It stood like a monument to their endurance. Each day they climbed up and lit it, hoping someone, anyone, might see. The smoke. Days passed, weeks, then the wind shifted. For the first time in months, it carried a faint scent. Salt, diesel, and something else. "Ship," one man whispered. They climbed the ridge, shielding their eyes from the glare, and far out at sea they saw a dark shape moving slowly through the ice. They stood in silence, afraid to believe it. After 349 days of isolation, rescue had finally come, but none of them could yet grasp that the war they had survived was no longer the one they had been sent to fight. On September 4th, 1945, the men of Operation Houdigan saw the impossible. A ship on the horizon. For almost a year they had watched the sea in vain. Ice, mist, endless gray. Now a faint plume of smoke rose above the water, growing larger as hours passed. Through binoculars they saw a vessel pushing through the floes, its bow cracking ice like thunder. At first they thought it must be German, a U-boat perhaps, sent at last to bring them home. But as it drew closer they saw the flag, red, white, and blue, with the cross of Norway. Their war was truly over. The ship was the Blachel, a small Norwegian sealing vessel on a post-war survey mission. Its crew had spotted the strange column of smoke that Deje's men had lit as a signal fire. When they anchored offshore, they expected to find wreckage, not armed Germans waiting on the beach. Dr. Wilhelm Dege, wearing his tattered Wehrmacht parka and carrying a sidearm that hadn't been fired in months, stepped forward and saluted. His men stood in formation behind him, thin, frostbitten, but disciplined to the end. In halting Norwegian, Dej called out, "Wir kapitulieren," we surrender. The Norwegians stared in disbelief. Germany had surrendered 4 months earlier. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ash. The war had ended everywhere, except here, on this forgotten island at the top of the world. Deje handed over his pistol, a gesture as symbolic as it was absurd. The Norwegian captain, equally stunned, took it and nodded. "You are the last," he said quietly, "the very last." The Haudegen men boarded the Blasel one by one, leaving behind their weather station, the huts half buried in snow, the frozen antenna still pointed towards the empty sky, the instruments still recording data. They brought only what they could carry: diaries, photographs, a few boxes of scientific samples. As the ship pulled away, they watched their camp shrink into the mist, a grave marker for a war that refused to end. For the Norwegians, it was like encountering ghosts. These men still carried Wehrmacht papers stamped with the eagle and swastika, still spoke in the clipped tones of soldiers, still believed in a chain of command that no longer existed. They had survived isolation, hunger, and madness, but not time. On the journey back to the mainland, they told their story to the stunned crew: the endless night, the silence, the storms, the radio messages from a Reich already in ruins. One Norwegian sailor later said, "They looked more like explorers than soldiers. The Arctic had washed the war off them." When they reached Tromsø, the news spread quickly. The world learned that the last German troops of World War II had surrendered, not in Berlin or the Alps, but on a frozen island north of everything, long after peace had been declared. They were interrogated, then quietly released. No charges, no trials. There had been no crimes in Haudegen, only endurance. Dr. Deje returned to Germany a free man, carrying his weather logs and his journals. He told reporters later, "Up there, politics meant nothing. Only the cold mattered. It was the true enemy." Operation Haudegen, Hitler's final Arctic mission, had outlived the Reich itself. In the end, the last shot of the war was never fired. It was a salute on a frozen beach, offered by men who had survived the impossible, surrendering to the world that had already forgotten them. When the Blasel steamed south through the gray Arctic fog, the 12 survivors of Operation Haudegen stood on deck in silence. The sea that had once imprisoned them now carried them home, to a home that no longer existed. They had been gone for a year, but history had moved a lifetime ahead. As the ice faded behind them, they shed their heavy parkas and black SS caps. The uniforms, once symbols of order and authority, now felt absurd, relics of a world that had devoured itself. One man muttered, "We went north for the Führer and found only the cold." No one answered. In Tromsø, the Norwegians received them not with hatred but with curiosity. The men were examined by doctors, fed hot meals, and questioned politely by Allied officers. There were no executions, no accusations. These were not war criminals, only stranded soldiers who had fought the Arctic instead of men. Their weapons were barometers, not rifles. Still, the enormity of what had happened began to sink in. The Reich was gone. Germany divided, cities in ruins, millions dead, families lost, flags burned. For these men, the war had lasted longer than for anyone else in uniform. They were the last troops of Nazi Germany to surrender. Dr. Wilhelm Deeg, the commander, returned quietly to Bremen. He resumed his work as a geographer and professor, rarely speaking of the year on Nordostland. When he did, he called it the loneliest front of the war. His wartime diaries, meticulous and scientific, were eventually published decades later. In their pages, he never mentioned ideology, only ice, storms, and endurance. It was as if he had gone to war for data, not for Hitler. The others faded into civilian life. A few married, raised families, built new lives in a new Germany. They rarely spoke of Haudegen. When they did, it was never about duty or heroism, only about survival. The cold, one veteran said, was the only enemy that treated us all the same. In 1985, more than 40 years later, a Norwegian expedition visited the remains of their station. The wooden huts still stood, buried in snow, untouched since the day the Germans left. Inside were rusted instruments, tins of food, and neatly stacked papers. Weather logs dated May 1945. On one wall, a calendar still hung with the last date circled in pencil. Surrendered today. The Arctic had preserved their outpost like a time capsule, a frozen museum of futility. The war had long ended, but the traces of these men remained, locked in ice. Today, historians call them the last soldiers of the Third Reich. They fired no shots, took no lives, and fought for a cause that had already crumbled. Yet their story endures because it strips the war of its grandeur and exposes its absurdity. They were not conquerors or fanatics, just men following orders into a place where orders meant nothing. Dr. Dej died in 1979. His journals were found among his belongings, filled with sketches of ice formations, meteorological charts, and a single line written near the end of the war. In the Arctic there is no enemy, no friend, no nation, only survival. That was the true legacy of Operation Haudegen. Not glory, not loyalty, not victory. Just the last echo of a lost army standing in the silence of the Arctic, fighting the only war left to them, the one against the cold.